format for tonight, 3 great speakers. Each person will speak for around 20 minutes, then we'll do Q&A. Oh, sorry. Okay, I'll shout a bit louder. Format, 3 speakers.
The mic is for the live stream.
Yeah, it's the mic is for the live stream, it's not to project to you. I'll try and talk louder. So each speaker will speak for about 20 minutes, then there'll be a short Q&A session. After the first 2 speakers, there will be a short break, then a final speaker, and then we all tend to go to the pub. It's the Perseverance, which is on Lamb's Conduit Street. Hashtag for tonight is Leg Up. If you're watching on the live stream and you have a question, tweet it with that hashtag and we will try and put it to the speakers. So, we've been wanting to do a Leg Up on gamification for a long time. Leg Up's been running for 3 years now. And when we started, gamification was very much a dirty word in education, and every time it was mentioned, someone would go, "Sss." And I think to some extent that's starting to change. And so we wanted to have an event which wasn't about pillorying gamification, but about looking at what it actually means in the context of education and looking at how it works. So I'd quite like to ask the audience now, maybe 2 or 3 of you could tell us what gamification means to you. Who would like to start? Who can I pick on? This gentleman here. Can you speak into the mic so the live stream people can hear you?
Incorporating risk and reward and chance into classroom experiences.
Okay, interesting. Anyone else like to? Tom?
Cheers. Greetings, live stream. So it's using game structures, systems, and achievement routes to encourage people to engage in areas outside of games. So it's applying those systems to areas where you wouldn't normally see them.
Anyone have a different interpretation? Okay, so hopefully all our 3 speakers will say a little bit about what gamification means to them when they start. We've got quite a lot of people in the audience today, and I'm curious to know where you all come from. So how many of you are actually involved in making educational games? Could we see a show of hands? Well, that's good. About a little more than half, maybe. How many of you are involved in marketing? A couple of you. How many of you are involved in gamification but not in education, in some other industry? None of you. Okay. So who are the rest of you then?
You ever asked who makes games, non-educational games?
Yeah, anyone making non-educational games? Yeah, okay, a few of you. And some teachers.
And who's in education?
Okay, a lot of you are in education, that's good. And who else is here? What other industries? Shout out some names. Therapy? Say again? You're a student. Okay, welcome. We like students. Okay, that's very interesting. But okay, I'm going to stop indulging myself now and pass the mic on to our first speaker, who is Wayne Holmes from Zondle. And I'm delighted that he's here to speak to us because he's been to speak at Leg Up before. How long ago was it, Wayne? 18 months ago. And I think a lot of things have changed for Zondle in that time, and I'm excited to hear about them. So without further ado, over to you, Wayne.
Well, thank you very much. As Kirsten mentioned, I'm from Zondle. I thought I'd tell you a little bit about me before starting so you had a vague idea of where I'm from. So last year I finished my PhD, really pleased about that, University of Oxford, and currently I teach at the University of Bristol, and I think of myself as almost a founding member of Leg Up. I've been coming along an awful long time, and I do remember one of the early sessions where the word gamification was mentioned, and it was more than a hiss. The entire room almost erupted. But anyway, my role is Head of Education for Zondle. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about Zondle, but I'm going to give you a little brief bit about it. So firstly, we use games, but we are not a game. We have many, many games on Zondle, and the way it works is that there's facilities for teachers and students to create questions. As it says there at the moment, it's about 2 million questions have been created. And then those questions, whatever the questions are chosen by either the teacher or the student gets to play them in their choice of game. So there's an absolute disconnect between the game on the one hand and the educational content on the other. They are not connected, but one is played in the other. And we're very pleased about this. 100 million questions have been answered as of about 3 days ago. So that was very exciting when that happened. So just a few features about Zondle. I'm not going to talk about any of them other than the bottom one, which is this picture here, because most of the games on Zondle, like most game-based learning, is about a student and an app, or a student and a computer doing whatever they do. And we realise that actually, particularly in the UK, but not just the UK, lots of kids, they don't get access to a computer during the classroom day. But what was missing was an opportunity to use game-based approaches to teaching. So Zondle Team Play is our game-based teaching app. It's been used something like around about 40,000 times it's been played, and that's involved about 500,000 students all around the world. So we're really pleased with that as a side on, and it's kind of played in a kind of Jeopardy game show style way. But the final thing I'll say about Zondle is what we try to do from the beginning is we ground everything we do in good research. So that's research about the neuroscience, it's research about the psychology, and it's particularly research about what actually happens in classrooms. So the question is, why have I been invited to talk about gamification? It is because, as I've said, most of the games on Zondle, they are reward games. There is that disconnect between them. So we're using games, we also use points, badges, leaderboards, all that kind of stuff, and it's all about engaging the students. And when we've spoken as an organisation using this particular method, and we've spoken in lots of places around the world, and time after time after time, we're dismissed. We're dismissed as gamification. So it's, you know, it's not good game-based learning. It's not a good use of games. It's a very superficial use of games. It's not sexy. It's not exciting. It's just gamification. And I kind of beg to differ with that just a little bit. Okay, so what I actually want to talk about is why I think using reward games are actually is a useful thing to do. And this, for me, is really fundamentally important. What happens, it seems to me, is a lot of games development, but also ed tech generally, is created by people who are extremely good at what they do. They're very clever people. But actually, they rarely ground what they're doing in really good research. And for me, I think that's a huge mistake. And one of the reasons in game-based learning why that's a mistake is because learning is complicated. Everyone seems to think they know about learning. I went to school. I know how learning takes place. But actually learning is very, very complicated. The neuroscience, the psychology, but also, as I said before, the actual practice of what happens in a school, in a classroom. Learning is complicated in other ways. I'm just going to rush through some. So the what of learning, the how of learning, the why of learning. It's not simple. And to think that you can come up with a tool, a game, an approach that's going to deal with all this kind of stuff, I'm not convinced. There's all these issues that you need to take into account, potentially. You know, a huge range of things, a huge range of approaches, huge range of problems, huge range of things. So why one thinks that one particular approach to making a game for learning is going to be answer all the problems makes no sense. Here we come down to a bit of learning theory. Behaviorism. Okay, we all know behaviorism, rewards, straightforward. Okay, gamification. Constructivism. Constructionism. The idea that we actually construct our knowledge through actually doing stuff. So if you think about it, the vast majority of people who are saying these are the kind of games, the immersive games, the exploratory games, using things like Minecraft, Tycoon, all those kind of games, where people actually working through problems and investigating problems, that fits very happily with the constructivist approach. Historically, constructivism comes after behaviorism, and one of the ways in which constructivism worked was they said, well, behaviorism is crap. You know, we've got to get rid of that. The way to do learning is through constructionism. The reality is that they're both important. You can't do learning without taking part in any of those things. And there's lots of people involved. How one can think they've got an entire understanding of what learning means, and therefore we can integrate that into a single game, as I say, beggars belief. So, for me, this is the problem of most game-based learning. Very little of it is grounded in good research, and a lot of game-based learning is created by people. They're clever, they're creative games developers, but they're not really understanding or not investigating that huge range of complexities about how learning takes place, what learning involves, and the history of, you know, the 100 years history of education research. That's just kind of put to one side. I had a conversation once with an Australian firm, and I saw their list of founders and what they were doing, and they said, and there wasn't anybody there with any education expertise. And so I contacted them and said, you know, I'm curious, why don't, if you're making games for learning, why don't you have somebody with education expertise? And they said, well, because we want to start with a tabula rasa. We're going to start from, you know, ground zero. They clearly didn't go to school themselves. The other aspect of game-based learning, and people involved in EdTech generally, for my money, is that people think, well, look, I'm not interested in schools and the way that schools run and the fact that kids go to school between 9 and 3:30. I think we should be disrupting education. And frankly, I agree with you. I'd love to disrupt education. A lot of the education, the methods that are used in education are crap, and I would love to get rid of them tomorrow. However, the reality is it isn't going to go tomorrow. So we can make a choice. We can actually work with the system and try and work within the system and actually help the kids. And for me, that's really important. So I don't want to ignore the real needs of students and teachers. I don't want to ignore the day-to-day realities of school. And I don't want to ignore the way in which, whether one likes it or not, education has become kind of commodified into questions, answers, multiple choices. That's happening, whether you like it or not. If you don't like it, fight the governments. Not of this country just, but also America and around the world. So we either ignore it or we try and help the kids with it. I also think that a lot of the games out there don't account for neuroscience, don't include learning objectives that educators would recognise. They don't help students navigate their day-to-day life. And they're pretty difficult to actually use within a school curriculum. So this game is something that I think goes an awful long way to starting to address some of these issues. The Mystery of Tiger River comes out of Arizona State University, and these guys, led by Sasha, they've been researching in this world for, I think it's almost 10 years. They, what did they come up with? Quest Atlantis. You might have heard of Quest Atlantis. So Quest Atlantis was the first project they did, and it's turned into this. And it's incredible. It's beautifully designed. It's highly engaging. It's immersive. It's also tagged to all the objectives of the US curriculum for the particular area. And it won at the European Computer Game-Based Learning Conference last year. They won first prize. He also talks about the notion of small G game experience versus big G game experience. And I think this is quite interesting, because what he's talking about is the game itself and everything that happens within the game. But he's also talking about that on its own is only part of the deal. You've also got to understand all the contextual stuff around that, how the game is used. And that's what all the big G game experiences are. But one of the things I think is really cool is that Sasha Barab is definitely right in there with immersive games. But look at the word that he introduces. This is his word, not my word. I've not put that in there. This is a direct quote, gamification, direct quote from his work. So he is admitting, he's understanding that actually getting your game right is only part of the deal. You've got to think about how it's integrated within the classroom, and gamification could be quite an important part of that. However, naturally, I think there's a problem with Tiger River. It only covers one topic. It's about the water cycle and pollution. And that's only a very small part of the school curriculum. It also takes a long time to play. It can take up to 5, 6, 7 hours to play. So, you know, how do you fit that as a busy teacher with a busy curriculum and busy exams coming up? How on earth do you fit that into the curriculum, into your day? It's really, really difficult. And the other thing, this one is very important to me, it assumes that all the children are going to enjoy that particular game style, that particular game approach. And for those of you involved in game design, you know that just isn't true. Everybody has differences. Everybody has different things they're interested in. And I just want to show you this very briefly. It's only short, if it works. Is it going to work? Oh, I don't have any sound, do we? We don't have any sound. Okay, so we won't worry about this. I forgot I even had this on here. Sean, there are speakers. It should be coming through here, shouldn't it? But on here.
Still, from a video project by Robbie Cooper called Immersion that documents how gamers look while they're playing games. It's actually a really interesting project. This is what I do. I create engaging experiences. I make educational games. The idea behind educational games is really simple. On the one hand, we have kids who struggle to engage with learning in the classroom. And on the other hand, these same kids spend an extraordinary amount of time and energy playing games. So wouldn't it be great if we could somehow use games to help kids engage with learning? It seems pretty straightforward. And because games are fun, the temptation is to think about them as motivators. You create a game, you create some educational content, and then you sort of wrap the game around the educational content to make it palatable. This doesn't work. In fact, this is basically what the educational games industry has been doing for the last 30 years, and so far we have failed to revolutionize education. There's a reason, and this is the reason. Chocolate-covered broccoli. I'll be honest, this just makes me wish I had some chocolate without so much broccoli in it.
Okay, so the reason I wanted to show you that is because Sean Boucher is a brilliant game designer. He understands games. But my argument is that Sean Boucher, despite how nice he is, he knows very little about education, about how it works. One of the things is, just to demonstrate this, he credits the notion of chocolate-covered broccoli to a guy who did a paper a couple of years ago, but actually it comes from 1999. So if he actually did look into the research properly, he'd actually get a better idea of how things took place. This is the person he did credit, a guy called Jacob Hadgood, who has done a game here. Now, Jacob Hadgood is even more bizarre from my perspective, because what he's produced, has anybody seen Zombie Division at all? Okay, Zombie Division is essentially a game. It's about teaching kids how to do multiplication. And the idea is that the little avatar is you, and you can pick up different weapons. The skeletons all have numbers on. If you pick up a weapon that's equal to a 5, you can kill that skeleton. If you pick up a weapon that's a 6, you can't kill that because 6 does not divide into 45 equally. And that's fine. I think it's fantastic. I think it's a really interesting game, a really interesting approach. But then Hadgood goes on the point. He argues very strongly that this is not gamification. This is not chocolate-coated broccoli. But it clearly is, because you don't actually learn about the multiplication here. What you're doing is you're practicing about the multiplication. And I think that's really useful stuff. If anything, it's perhaps not chocolate-coated broccoli, but a chocolate and broccoli layer cake, but nevertheless, it's the same kind of deal. So this is my research, and one of the things you'll notice is I'm not a game developer. So my game doesn't look sexy. The other games have all looked really sexy. My game doesn't, because I'm an educator first and foremost. But what we're trying to do here, this was with kids who are having difficulties with their mathematics, and the idea is very simple addition sums. So we set up, it's a platform game, and the first time they come here, they have to play with the blocks to fill the hole, and whatever they work out is working out. So in other words, the kid is having to work out which of those lumps go together to fill that hole. So there's no mathematics at the moment, it's just objects into holes. But then once they've done that, they go on to the next problem, and it's the same problem. And the second time they encounter it, the blocks are now numbered, have numbers on, so that one would have a 2, that would have a 4, and so on, and this would have a number in. But it's exactly the same task. And once they've done that, they then continue down the path, and they come across exactly the same problem again for a third time, but this time there are just numbers. So once they've done that those 3 times, they then go on, then there'll be another numeracy problem. So what I'm trying to do here is both get the constructivist learning in, so they're actually having to construct their own ideas about how to answer this particular problem, but there's also the repetition built in, the gamification repetition and the practice in order to get through it, and so that it builds that way as well. So that's the behaviorism part. I could have just showed you these, I suppose. There you go, very simple. So back to my premise then, learning is complicated. And this is the key. The learning takes place in stages. There's lots of stages in learning. I'm not arguing this is comprehensive, but I'm arguing all these things take into account. So firstly, you've got to encounter, whatever it is you're going to learn about, you've got to encounter it in some way. Then the next thing you would do is you relate that somehow to something you already knew, rightly or wrongly. Then you assimilate it, and you have to, some kind of understanding has to take place. Then you have to encode it into your memory, consolidate it, get it to an automatic state if relevant, and then later you should be able to recall. So all these different stages, and people are really arguing that there's only one way to make educational games that deals with all these things. I'm interested in practice. So in a sense, the top lot, that's the immersive game approach. That's what they're very, very good at. And I think they are very, very good at. But they're not very good at, if you experience the water cycle and you get all that top stuff in, a week later the chances are you won't remember the water cycle because you've not practiced anything. But those bottom ones, the ones in red, they all require practice. So for example, the quadratic equation, I remember this. X equals minus b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac all over 2a. I learned that 35 years ago, I think. I've used it maybe 5 times since when working with my son, because I practiced it. That's how I remember it, through practice, not through encountering it. Yes, I had to do practice with it, but just remembering it, practicing that equation. Another one, French. I know this because I practiced it. I don't remember ever being in a circumstance where needing to know the French for traffic lights, but it's feu de circulation. Brilliant pronunciation, I'm sure you'll agree. But anyway, the point is, I knew that because I practiced it over 30 years ago. And this is what happens when you practice. Everyone's familiar with this, a neuron. This is the axon going off to other neurons. And the point is, it's the speed at which the signal runs down the axon here. And the speed of that signal depends on how much of this stuff is wrapped around it, the myelin. And the more times that you send a signal down there, the more myelin wraps around it. Myelin doesn't go away. So that's why habits are sometimes hard to break, or it's one of the reasons, because you've got the myelin down those particular axons. So what you need to do is you need to put myelin down other axons to break a habit. But this is what it's all about. It's through practice that gets the myelin, that makes these synapses really strong so that you remember this stuff, so that later on you can recall it, apply it, transfer it, all those really critical things. So how does that fit in with Zondle? Well, the reality is Most of the Zondle games are about practice. Hands up, I admit that, and I don't have a problem with that. I think it's really important that that's what they are. And the reason for that is because what we're addressing, for the most part, are curriculum subjects on which these children are going to be examined. So they need to put the practice in. Now, we're not arguing, we're teaching, we're giving opportunities for practice. However, there are other things where they're not going to be examined. A particular case in point at the moment is internet safety. Internet safety is a crucial thing. The new IT curriculum in the UK barely touches internet safety. I think internet safety is really important, but it's not something that children are examined on. So we've set up a competition where we're inviting game developers on the one hand, but also students on the other hand, to design some immersive games that deal with the issue of internet safety. As I say, because it's not something they're going to be examined on, it's something that we do need to experience. So I'm not arguing that gamification is the way. I'm arguing that gamification is one of the ways. And the reason for that is because I think learning is complicated. Thank you very much. Would anybody like to ask a question?
Okay. Thank you for the presentation. It's really good. I would like to know, you probably know, and I would like to know your opinion on the website, the Brain Rush, which has those really small games, and it's all about learning really small pieces of information and practice on a small amount of time. Oh, okay. Okay. Good question. Good.
Hi, thanks very much. I was just wondering if you thought there was a good ratio of chocolate to broccoli that might be effective.
That's a very good question. I've no idea. I think it depends. My thesis is that learning is complicated, and as games developers in the world of education, we have to think about all that complexity, and I think there will be times where the chocolate is really important. One area where the chocolate's really important, disengaged learners. You know, my research project was about kids who've been studying maths for 8 years, and they still can't add 2 and 5. These kids are pulled out. Now, for them, they need lots of chocolate, and I don't see that's a problem. Let's give them the chocolate. You know, basically, education has fucked them up. And now it's time to say, okay, what can we do to help them get back on board? So for them, loads of chocolate. For others, not so much.
Do you think there's an age at which this approach tails off? Because I can see, it works really well for Key Stage 1, Key Stage 2. But do you think when you get into exam subjects that it's just less useful?
Hands up if you play Angry Birds. Hands up if you play Flappy Bird. Hands up if you play any of those silly games. My answer is I don't think it does wear off. We have students using Zondle from 3-year-olds up to university students. And there are times, my own children, when they were students, when they were studying for their A-levels, they would occasionally play the silly games, but then other times they would just use the quiz format. So whatever they want to do, but a lot of people I think enjoy the silly games because our games, they're 5-minute games. That's the point of them. They're brief, they're short. The idea is you play them often, and if you hate the Flappy Birds version, you go and do shooting footballs, or you make a pizza, or you save your bunny, whatever. So it's that opportunity to do what the heck you like gives a bit of ownership to them. So I think it depends.
Hi. You've talked about the research and that you're research-based, but how about results? What analytics have you used and what kind of results have you got? And, you know, for example, have you, you know, tested groups of students, done blind tests, all that kind of stuff?
The short answer is no. The Zondle Team Play, the teaching-based app that I talked about, has had 4 years of research that's looked at all those kind of things. The main approach hasn't. But the reason for that is that we're unfunded. What we're doing at the moment is we're putting in for various research funding because that's exactly what we want to do. But you know, I'm fairly confident. But it has to be done.
There was a question back here.
Thanks. Really good presentation. Thanks for that. I was just wondering at the end of that how to try and learn some of this stuff for myself. What's a good place to start in reading up on all these great sources that you mentioned?
www.zondle.com.
And you
We have links for lots of the research. Not enough. We're building it over time. There's a lot there.
Thanks.
Can I ask a question as well? So you've talked about personalising your content to the curriculum. Are you interested in doing any sort of personalisation to the actual user themselves, or is that something you've looked at?
Sorry, can I
There's a big push on at the moment, isn't there, for adaptive learning. I think that's kind of what you're referring to. The problem is that the level at which the really well-known adaptive learning people are doing is they're basically saying you plug a child in at the beginning and the computer system will work it all out and will adjust everything on a minute-by-minute, day-by-day basis. And what that's basically saying to a teacher is, well, you don't need to be there because the computer does it for you. What we've done is differently. We do use adaptivity, but on much smaller chunks. So, for example, we have a phonics app, which is all about practice, all about silly games, but it starts off with 1,500 questions, and then the app will work out approximately where the child is on the first play, and then slowly but surely move them up, bouncing back and forward, trying to respond to their abilities. But it's about doing it in small chunks, not in the big chunks. So it's about doing it in ways that support the teacher to do what they want to do, not saying, hey, we're the clever tech people, we can do your job for you.
Yeah, just I was going to ask about mapping to the curriculum, but I must have missed it that you have done this. Have you had schools basically adopt this platform and actually prescribe it to their students? And do you then have the evidence, if you can call it that, from teachers to help you in your case for greater funding?
We set up Zondle 2.5, 3 years ago, and it was based on my research and research I'd come across and so on and so forth. But all of the developments over the past 2 years have been in response to what teachers have asked us. So I usually say we started off with games and we were that big, and now we're games but we're this big in terms of what we offer. So it's all been in response. But to pick up on the curriculum bit is we don't map stuff to the curriculum. It's our users. So the nearly 2 million questions we've got have mostly been created by our users, and they map it to their own curriculum. So it's all there for sharing, but they tag it and all the other things to make sure it's available. Yeah, we've done some stuff and some surveys, and that is the evidence we get all the time. And we're constantly we have a brilliant ongoing conversation with our users. And what happens is they always start by saying, and I honestly am not exaggerating, they all start by saying, we love Zondle, our students run down the corridor because they know they're doing Zondle this week. However, I've got this little problem, can you help? But they always start with that opening line. It's quite astonishing. And we have loads of testimonials on the site of the kind of things that are said to us.
Wayne, I've got a slightly tricky question which, from someone who's not a researcher, probably sound a bit odd, but what do you think about the time lag in most educational research? Because if you look at, say, someone like Roland Fryer at Harvard, his argument is it needs to be a lot quicker because by the time you design your research and implement it and get it done and analyse it and you get to the end of the process, it takes several years. And actually it needs to be a lot quicker than that if you really want to, implement and make changes quickly. And I'm not sure with the sort of, whether the link between research and good games, how closely that can be given that time lag. And I think from a commercial perspective, there's also that I don't think in the investments that I've looked at in the last 10 years in this area, there's a tight link between solid research behind edtech products and success. And probably the most successful investors, I can't think of the name, they're in New York at the moment. They opened up their research about a year ago, and Emily Waters, who's a fairly well-known educational blogger, tore it to bits, saying it was all basically crap, and it probably was. But actually the guys from the fund said, yes, well, all that shows you is that there's no link between educational research and a successful edtech product. So having lots of research might be great, but actually from an investor's point of view, does it make a piece of shit difference? Probably not.
We'll have to talk about this later, but I think you're wrong. I think you're wrong. I think, the question in the UK, there hasn't been much investment in edtech over the past 2 years. Since I've been involved, there hasn't been. And the reality is that the results we're getting, the growth we're seeing, I sincerely believe is because of that research foundation. And the surveys we've done have pushed that as well. The only reason we exist and the only reason we're getting the interest we're getting is because of the research, I think. But
although to be fair, when I was at South Bay a couple of weeks ago, every teacher, real teacher I met, every one of them, when they heard that I was from England, said, "Oh, we use Zondle, it's fantastic." So that's the sort of counterpoint. That I was actually astounded at how many people. I probably met 30 teachers while I was there, and everyone who's elementary school teacher had used your product in their life.
yeah, the only problem is I missed that on the mic, but thank you, Richard.
How are we doing for time, Kirsten?
We should probably be moving on to the next speaker soon, but there's time for maybe 1 or 2 more questions.
I'm not even sure this is a question, but I have it might be a semantic problem with your statement, but because learning is complicated, is it learning that's complicated or is it understanding learning that's complicated? Because we're involved in something where it's in the same space as you are. And some most difficult things we saw can be solved with very easy things like your chocolate-covered broccoli. For us, was getting a one focal point in the front of the room. That's focus of the game. It's one of the simple things we're doing. And for us, is I don't know. I mean, researchers tend to want to make things very difficult when it can be solved with simple things. And I don't know if you've seen that, but I feel like a lot of people are trying to do this. They're putting very complex models around things that can be solved very simply.
I think the key thing is I'm not saying all research is good research. There's an awful lot of crap research out there. I'm just saying that the research that I've come across and the research I've done and my colleagues have done actually is focused on the 3 things, because research is fragmented like the world of business. And so there are great neuroscience researchers, there are great psychology researchers, there are great games researchers, there are great learning researchers. The problem is there are not many people who pull the 4 things together, and that's what we're trying to do. So the scenario you were describing, it fits with what we're saying. And I think good researchers that are looking across those would come to those kind of conclusions. So I'm not sure if that's an answer to your non-question, but that was your attempt.
Do we have time for one more? One more, yeah.
Brilliant. Thanks for the presentation, which I really enjoyed. Doing my homework for this session, I had a little look in the site, and I was very impressed by the variety of the templates that you produced for all kinds of different questions and so forth. However, when I actually looked at the Zondles people created, they tended to focus on multiple choice. What do you think about, do people create more than multiple choice? And if they are mainly multiple choice, what do you think about that, given that multiple choice has a similar kind of reputation as gamification in education circles?
The first thing that all of the question types that we have on Zondle, there's about 15, are being used without a shadow of a doubt. Lots of pictures being used, lots of music and sounds being used, as well as questions. There's sequencing questions, there's phonics questions, there's translation questions. There's a whole range of different things. But I completely agree with you, the majority, if not even the vast majority, are multiple choice. But I think the problem again is that multiple choice have a bad reputation. It's really quite difficult to write good multiple choice questions, but if you do, then they can be really effective. So it's possible and straightforward to write multiple choice questions that elicit understanding. You know, have you understand this paragraph of text? Can you, make your choices based on your understanding rather than just recall? So it's about that balance. And again, we've got advice for that on the website. But one of the things we would love to be able to do is to do some kind of online CPD so that we can give that support in a more proactive way. All that information is there at the moment, but, teachers are busy people and they need a lot of support to do these things. But the other thing we're also doing is we're partnering with lots of publishers who are creating lots of material and bringing that in. And sometimes that material from the publishers is much better than generally is on Zondle. So it's addressing the things in different ways.